Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the closing keynote. So for some of us, it's already been 4 days. For others, it's been 2 days of jam-packed thinking, feeling, interacting with lovely, lovely people. Have you guys enjoyed conference so far? That's what I like to hear. So we have about an hour and a half right now to kind of close things out. And the theme for the closing keynote is commitment to Africa. So yesterday, a lot of you were probably at the systems thinking panel. And you've probably all seen a lot of talk on systems thinking through a variety of different events that we've had throughout the conference. And I think one of the things that, the feedback that we get constantly when we talk about things at such a large level is, what does this mean for individuals? How does one person actually affect change within a system? How do we bring a movement forward in a variety of different areas and ways, and what are the different roles that people can play? So for this closing keynote, we're bringing up 2 different people that have played really interesting roles in this, this big, messy change that we're all trying to move forward. So we're bringing up Martin Fisher, who is the founder of KickStart, which is a really fascinating business that is scaling treadle pumps across Africa. And we're also bringing Mr. John Githongo back up, who is an incredible Kenyan who has been a major force towards fighting corruption in Africa, which we all know is a major thing to contend with. And I just want to take a couple seconds to talk about kind of why these people are so important, and also potentially contrast them a little bit, because I think this is what makes it special. So Martin is starting a new model. Not many people have brought new products to Africa and started to drive an industry. And that's what it's really about, bringing new products that have never been bought before, never been sold before, never been seen before by people, and getting many, many people to adopt them and make money and improve their lives through them. That takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of big thinking. He's an engineer, like all of us. He's a great example of someone who's taken his engineering mindset and applied it to a new kind of problem in a different way than the typical engineer would. His business does use treadle pumps. He has been heavily involved in the design of the technology, which I'm sure fulfills his engineering cravings. But he is also an incredibly pragmatic individual who has a very strong business model and a very strong business sense. So it's pretty neat to have him up here to talk about how you make change. How does it actually have to work? And then we have John, also an incredible amount of courage to stand up and say things that need to be said, to speak with honesty about a system that is not working very well, to speak with heart, to drive other people to stand up to a system that's not working very well. So what tonight's going to look like is Martin's going to come up for a 45-minute talk, and then we're going to invite John up onto the stage, and we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So throughout Martin's presentation, you all have little cards on your table, or you will shortly. What we'd like you to do is any questions that you have, write them down on a piece of paper, raise up your arm, and somebody will come collect it from you. I will then be handed a package of questions at the end of Martin's speech, and John will come up on the stage and we'll have a Q&A where they will talk about their commitment to Africa and to social change. So without further ado, I'd love to invite Martin Fisher up to the stage.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brett. And thank you all for being here. I'm honored and inspired to have the chance to talk to all of you. I know there's a lot of people in the audience who are doing incredible things around the world. and many of you who could actually be up here in my place. So it's a real honor to have been chosen to be up here. Thank you. I'm going to tell you my personal story and a lot of the lessons that I've learned through that journey, and the story of KickStart, both the past and the future of what we have done and where we are going. And it all really got started back when I was in graduate school, and I come from a family where to qualify for the family you need to do a PhD in physics. And so I was being a dutiful son, and I was at Stanford, and I was doing my PhD in theoretical and applied mechanics, but in a physics lab, and I almost made it. But I realized that the more education I got, the less I was actually qualified to do. And as I was working on this PhD, I realized that I was uniquely qualified to either try to teach, although I didn't really know anything to teach at a university, or I could work for big oil, or I could go do military research. And none of that was really too exciting for me. And so I had some friends who were from developing countries, and they tried to get me excited about appropriate technology and the whole appropriate technology movement. And I was like, yeah, right, I'm going to use my Stanford PhD to go to Africa and design pumps or something like that. But on the other hand, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my future, and I was going to get this PhD, so I went off to Peru and went trekking in the mountains to sort of ponder my future. And that was really my first time to come face to face with real poverty. And I started thinking, okay, well, maybe there is something that I could do, maybe it's worth taking a look. And I came back and decided to apply for a Fulbright fellowship to go back to Peru and spend a year looking at technology and poverty. And 2 days before the applications were due, they told me, look, we're sorry, you don't speak Spanish, you're not going to Peru. And I flipped through the catalog, and I said, oh, Kenya, they speak English there. Maybe I can get a Fulbright to go there. And I put in an application and got lucky enough to get the scholarship. I went down to Kenya for 10 months, and I ended up staying for 17 years. And so here I am back in 1985. And on top of a mountain in Kenya. But as we know, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is really the world's very, very poorest place. And, 40% of the people go to bed hungry every night, and 45% of the people live on less than $1 a day. And I always think that particular figure is very misleading, because as we all know, in fact, many of these families are living on less than $1 a day, let alone people living on less than $1 a day. We have people who are living on, 10 cents a day, 20 cents a day. And one of the scary figures from Africa is that, half the population is less than 19. So that's a huge challenge going forward. And of course, it's the only place in the world that is actually still getting poorer with downward spiral, and we still have states which are failing, and more so. And so I went, and I was hoping to find something happening in the appropriate technology movement, because I'd read Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, and I reckoned this was, I was going to go to Kenya and find all sorts of projects I could just sort of slot into. But by 1985, in fact, everybody had given up on the appropriate technology movement, as so often happens with development movements. Everybody gets very excited for 10 years, they spend a lot of money, then they realize there's no impacts, and they all walk away from it, throw the baby out with the bathwater, and move on. And so when I got to Kenya, I talked to people, and they said, oh, we're not interested, technology, that's yesterday's story. And I was like, okay, I don't know, I'm an engineer, and I just thought maybe technology could be useful. But I did find a small group at ActionAid, which is a British organization similar to Save the Children, and they were working on low-cost school construction, on developing low-cost buildings. And I started volunteering with them, because with a PhD from Stanford, that's all you can do when you want to get into development is volunteer. And I did that for a couple of years before they finally offered me a job. But when I was at ActionAid, I met this guy, Nick Moon. And Nick, very different background to mine. He was a carpenter. He was a high school dropout. He had his successful carpentry business in London, had given that up to go out to Kenya and live in rural Kenya and was teaching rural artisans how to make furniture. And then he ended up at ActionAid on this low-cost building project. And it's Nick and I have worked together ever since. And when I was in ActionAid, because I worked for them for 5 years, I said, well, we don't have a water project at ActionAid. We don't have a water program. And no doubt a poor person's number one need must be water. And so I went out and set up what was one of the larger rural water programs in Kenya at the time, and we dug wells and we put in community pumps and dams and protected springs and ferrocement tanks, all sorts of good things, working with the communities. I then set up a couple of rural workshops where we mass-produced farm equipment, ox-drawn plows and harrows and carts that we gave away to poor rural farmers. And I worked with a lot of youth groups and women's groups, designed some machinery and set them up in small businesses manufacturing low-cost building materials. And all of these things sound great, and all of these things are absolutely typical development, but the reality is most of them really don't work. As we know, Africa is littered with 50 to 100,000 broken down community water points. And why is that? It's because when you first commission the pump, everybody's very excited and the water operates and there's nice clean water. And 3 or 4 years later when the pump breaks down, guess what? That committee that you set up who was supposed to manage it, well, that was 3 or 4 years ago. They're not managing it anymore. It's tragedy of the commons. Nobody owns the pump. Nobody's going to fix it. And they go back to their old ways. The rural workshops giving away farm equipment, well, people didn't really appreciate it because we were giving it to them. It wasn't really what they wanted, but much worse than that, there's a guy down the road trying to produce farm equipment, and once our project money runs out, guess what? They're out of business because we put them out of business. Youth and women's groups, well, turns out they're not really very entrepreneurial, so as long as we're holding their hands, they can run a little business. And the minute we walk away, the business collapses. Down the road, there's an entrepreneur who would have liked to get into the business, couldn't compete. The best thing that ever happened was in one of these groups, one of the group members stole the equipment and went and started a business. And of course, we called him a thief and called the police, but in retrospect, he was the only entrepreneur we had. So 5 years of learning, and I'm a little slow, but we learned a few things. Individual or family ownership really is the best. Group or community ownership, like I said, it doesn't work all that well. Nobody likes to repair things they don't own. Sell things, don't give them away for all the reasons I've said, but also because giving away, it turns out people think it's easy, but it's not easy. It's not only not fair, it's not sustainable, it's actually quite expensive. You have to figure out how to give things away, who to give them to. Of course, it hurts the private sector, it creates dependency, all sorts of things. Now, there are times when things need to be given away. If in relief situations, if people are dying, yes, you have to do that. And in public health also, there's good arguments to give things away for vaccinations and things like that. But generally, no. I went over to Kenya really thinking I'm going to go and help, and as a sort of socialist, and after a few years came back as a sort of small C capitalist. The other thing, big lesson, is that really nothing goes to scale. And there's all sorts of little islands of success in development, but nothing is really scaled up. And the other lesson I learned, and really the most important lesson, and it took me a while, but is that everybody actually lives in a cash economy. They're just like we are. They need money. However poor they are, they need money for everything. They need money to buy food, enough food to eat. Even if they can grow something, they can't grow cooking oil. They can't grow salt. They need money for food. They need money for farm inputs. They need money to build a house. They need money to buy the cooking pots, to buy the fuel. They have to pay for education. The idea of free education is nice, but actually you have to pay for it even when it's free because you got to pay your bribes, you got to pay your school fees. Healthcare, same thing. They have to pay for that. They have to pay for transport, communication, lighting, water, sanitation. They have to pay for everything. In fact, the number one need of a poor person is only one thing, a way to make more money. And it wasn't always the case, but it switched after the Cold War when these economies switched from sort of subsistence and controls economies to cash-based economies. It used to be that the ex-Soviet Union and the United States and the donors were giving so much money to Africa that we had dictators there who could provide basically free education and healthcare and subsidize essential commodities, and at the same time, no. Oh, sorry, okay. And at the same time, the farm sizes were big. You could farm on a big plot of land. You could go into the forest, cut down the trees, go hunting, and you could really survive by growing enough crops, selling a little bit, buying the subsidized goods, sending your kids to school and educating them with very, very little money. You didn't need a lot of money. End of the Cold War, we brought in structural adjustment. The aid to Africa went down by a factor of 10. Literally overnight, people are thrown into this cash economy. And they have to pay for education, pay for healthcare, and no more subsidies on essential commodities. The farm sizes have shrunk, the forest is cut down. They need money just to survive. And in fact, this is the biggest problem all over the world. It's not only in Africa, but of course it's an issue in China, it was an issue in the ex-Soviet Union, all sorts of places. Overall, the world needs about 1.5 billion new jobs. We talk about unemployment in America, but this is a much bigger issue. And I actually think it's the world's biggest problem. And the formal private sector, which we turn to for help, helps a bit, but not much. In Kenya, employs 7% of the labor force. In Tanzania, 3.5%, and even in India, only 10%. Everybody else needs to make money. What do we do? What's the solution? Well, the solution is the people themselves. People are very poor, yes, but they're also extremely entrepreneurial. To be honest, they have to be just to survive, very hardworking. And how do we know? Because the informal sector is absolutely booming. It was the same time that the informal sector started booming. People went out and begged, borrow, or saved a few dollars to start businesses in the informal sector so they could make enough money to survive. Basically, if you don't have money, you can't live. And people in the informal sector, as we know, are mainly doing all the same thing, doing petty trade, buying and selling the same things, competing with each other. They're making enough to survive, but they're not making enough to get out of poverty. But what we do know is that they want opportunities and not handouts, and people are hardworking and entrepreneurial. And the reason they're not making enough money to get out of poverty is because fundamentally these people in the informal sector, the millions of them, are really in the wrong businesses. They're all competing with each other, all selling the same product at the same time. All the farmers are growing the same product at the same time, selling it at the same time, and they're surviving but not getting out of poverty. And it's hard to identify a good business idea. And even if you do, it's really hard to access the right tools and equipment that you need, that you can afford to buy, that you can use to start a business that are going to get you out of poverty. That equipment simply is not available, certainly not available in your local marketplace, and actually you discover generally not available anywhere in the world. So we said, let's solve this problem. And in 1991, established an organization called APROTEC, we later called it KickStart, with a mission to take millions of people out of poverty and do this by developing very low-cost tools and equipment that very poor people could buy and use to start very profitable businesses. Now, it's great to start an organization, and we left ActionAid. I should actually say that Nick and I, we were asked to leave ActionAid because they didn't believe what we were doing, and they told us that we should leave. In the time before we actually left, we did manage to get a matching grant from the British. And a matching grant is great, but it doesn't help you at all because you can't spend it unless you can match it. And so for the first couple of years, we matched it with our salaries, basically work for nothing, and then we had enough that we could hire a few people and start something, but we couldn't even raise enough for the match. And then an opportunity came along. And an opportunity which was really a tragedy. This is the Somali refugee crisis of 92-93, when 350,000 Somalis poured across the border into the desert of northern Kenya, and refugee camps had to be built. And in a refugee camp, you have to feed people, you have to give them water, you have to put up tents and shelters. Anybody who hasn't visited a refugee camp should. They're incredible to see in terms of the operations that happen there. But one of the things you have to do in a refugee camp is you have to provide toilets. And for the first time in the history of UNHCR, the Somali refugees may be smarter than many of the other refugees, but but they refused to use communal toilets. Usually you put in a toilet, a communal toilet, and a few hundred people share it. But many of the Somali refugees were nomadic people, and quite rightly, you don't go to the toilet where someone else has been to the toilet. And so there was a problem, and the whole desert was turning into a sewer. And we had been playing with a very low-cost technology for making a dome pit latrine slab. A dome slab made out of a bag of, 3/4 of a bag of cement, no reinforcing in it at all, and we developed a way for doing high-quality mass production in the desert with very unskilled labor. We did a small project with CARE where we did 4,000 of these individual family pit latrines, and we then went on and did 45,000 of these. And the reason we did is because it's a multi-million-dollar project, and when you work for UNHCR, you get about 6% above costs. We used that 6% to match our grant, so we could actually do what we wanted to do. And we ended up training all the other agencies and did something like 100,000 pit latrines in East Africa. Every refugee camp, people use our toilets. But that's technology for relief. What about technologies for development? That's what we really wanted. So we rented a little office and workshops in the slums in Nairobi, and we set off. But what kind of technologies can really take people out of poverty? Well, a poor person's #1 need is a way to make money, so this technology must make money for someone. People talk about labor-saving devices or time-saving devices. Well, the frank truth is that a poor person has a lot of time and a lot of labor, and the opportunity cost of their time and labor is very, very low. They're not going to pay much money to save time or labor. They'll pay a little bit of money, but not a lot of money. They may pay as much as a chicken to save time or labor. I always like to use a chicken there because however poor a family is anywhere in the world, they can usually afford to buy one chicken to eat at least once a year. So it's a nice value of what even a very poor family can afford. So for a money-saving device like a efficient stove or a solar lantern or something like that, it better be really cheap. It must be a money-making device because poor people want to make money. And it must be affordable. They don't have a lot of money. And it must have a very profitable business model. Very quick cost recovery within 3 to 6 months. Why 3 to 6 months? Because poor people are generally farmers. They're used to putting their money in the ground for 3 to 6 months. Farm time, then they have to be able to get it back. So what kind of new businesses? Well, they must serve the local market, at least initially. Why is that? Because a poor person can't suddenly be selling things to people living in New York City or people living even in Nairobi. They know their local market. They don't know the big cities. And the best product would be something they can sell locally and then into a town and city and then export. But first of all, it has to serve the local markets. And that means they're going to be selling to poor people because their neighbors are poor also. So they're selling products and services to poor people. Well, guess what? We just made a list of all the things that poor people buy. So we have a nice list of all the possible businesses that they could have. And it turns out there's many, many possible business opportunities to sell to poor people and make money. And why is that? Because if you do the market research, you can find out poor people pay the highest price per unit for everything. So there's all sorts of opportunities. They pay a high price for money. That's why microfinance works. They pay a high price for food, electricity, light, everything else. And they pay for bad quality products and services. Therefore, healthcare, education, water, construction, all these things. You can easily have a business that improves on what they have. And they get paid very little for their products that they sell. There's a whole other set of business opportunities. Grain banks, marketing services. You compete with existing businesses. Avoid packaging and transport because they pay for stuff which has been taken from their farms, taken to the city, and brought back in packages. You can have new leapfrog technologies, cell phones, solar, LEDs. And the other thing is that the poor are very cash flow constrained, right? Therefore, there's all sorts of new business models. And this is things like credit, layaway, franchise services, pay-as-you-go, prepaid. So there's a ton. Just got to find them. Other lessons we learned is the poor deserve high-quality design and engineering. None of this do-it-yourself stuff. They want something which is reliable, just like we want something that's reliable. It's not going to break down. They do it themselves. That means you're doing mass production at a large scale in large factories. That means you're going to sell these things through the private sector. It's the most sustainable way to get things out there. Sell them through the local retail shops where people already go to buy things. It's sustainable, it's cost effective. And then you have to mass market and let them know about it. And that labor's very cheap. You can use very labor-intensive methods to mass market. So what kind of products? There's one of our early products, a stabilized soil block press for making very quality, high-quality bricks out of soil and cement, compressed at very high pressure. This machine costs about $350. This particular entrepreneur here, a small-scale farmer, he started with one of these machines, ended up with 4 machines, 45 employees. Today, he's a big businessman in Nairobi and has his own shopping mall. And we never met this guy, but we put the right technology out there, and this is the power of technology. You put it out there, and the private sector picks it up and runs with it, and entrepreneurs do. That's how Silicon Valley came about, and it's the same in Africa. So we've got a few thousand businesses doing that. Here's a machine for making cooking oil out of sunflower seed. This particular woman was a single mother with 2 daughters. She was determined that her daughters would go to university. She was a school teacher. She couldn't afford to pay for them. She saved up with her brother, bought one of these machines, contracted 20 farmers to grow sunflower. Both her daughters have graduated from university. She sells animal feed, which is the byproduct, and sunflower seed, and she's bought her own land, which she didn't have before, built a house. She employs 3 young men. A machine for baling hay. A few thousand of those oil presses are out there too. A machine for baling hay. Turns out this is another great business because if you have an animal on a small plot that you want to zero graze, guess what? That means you have to feed it, and in the wet season you can grow Napier grass. In the dry season you have to buy hay. How do you transport hay? You have to bale it. Someone who grows hay has to bale it. This particular baler, 80 bales a day, got a few hundred of these out there. It's a great service business that's baling. But all these are quite expensive and quite complicated businesses. What business for your average African? 1/3 of the people in the world and 80% of the poor people in Africa are poor rural farmers. They live on a small plot of land, 1 acre, 2 acres, half an acre, sometimes even 1/8 of an acre these days. What business can they start? If we're not talking about rural, we're not talking about tackling poverty. The best business that they can get into is irrigated agriculture. Because with irrigation, they can get away from the boom and bust of the rain-fed agriculture where everybody harvests at the same time and sells at the same time. The price goes through the floor, they can't sell, right? With irrigation, they grow high-value crops. They grow them throughout the year. They get 3 or 4 growing cycles a year, and they bring them out in the times when the price is high and nobody else has them. You can make a huge amount of money. Only 4% of the farmland in Africa is irrigated, mainly in Madagascar, in sub-Saharan Africa. And 42% of the land in Asia is irrigated. And irrigation is even more needed now with climate change. You can no longer even rely on the rains. So there's a huge potential, but there was no affordable technology. So we designed some human-powered irrigation pumps. We call them the moneymaker pumps. This pump's called the super moneymaker. A poor person only cares about one thing, making more money. It's their number one need. What we're selling is a better life. We introduced this in '99. This is a little Stairmaster machine. You walk back and forth. You have a hose pipe. It goes down into a well, pulls water up, then distributes it through another hose pipe. You can push it, pull it from 25 feet deep. You can push it another 25 feet vertical or hundreds of meters along the ground through a hose pipe. It irrigates 2 acres of land. It retails at $98. And this is very efficient irrigation. It's like irrigating with a garden hose pipe. You put the water directly on the plants. It's not like flood or channel irrigation. This particular woman here, Janet, she lived in Western Kenya, had 6 children. She had a co-wife and a husband. The co-wife had another 3 children. And as happens in that particular area, the co-wife and the husband both died of HIV/AIDS, leaving Janet with 9 children to look after. In that particular area, when your husband dies, you're supposed to be inherited by your husband's brother. And Janet refused. As a result, she was disowned by the family and left with absolutely nothing on a 2-acre plot with these kids. And she had a bucket, and she had a little stream that ran through the plot. And with that bucket, she started with the kids irrigating a little plot of cabbages, just enough to stay alive. Then one day, she's in town, and she sees these funny-looking guys selling this funny-looking pump here, and she decided to buy this thing. She saved up her money for almost 9 months with the cabbages and the bucket. She bought the pump. She employed 2 young men. She irrigated the full 2 acres. Her first year, she made $3,200 profit. This is a huge amount of money in Africa. Today, she's a community leader. She's telling other women they don't have to be inherited. She's built a house for herself, house for her son, and she's doing very well. And that's a $100 pump. We need a cheaper pump. So we said, okay, a Stairmaster is nice, but it's expensive. How can you make a cheaper pump? So in 2006, we thought about this, and first of all, we said, let's design a hand pump. Now, a hand pump, and here I'm going to step away from the microphone for a second. A hand pump, you would operate like a bicycle pump, like this. And your arms would get very tired very quickly. So we designed this little pump here. Now, this little pump here allows you, looks like a hand pump, but your arms get tired. You put a pivot on it. You can operate like this. You can do this all day. You can get into a digging motion. Just by putting a pivot there, you completely change the ergonomics of this little pump. So this little pump can also pull water from 25 feet deep, can also push it 25 feet vertical. You can irrigate 1¼ acres with this little pump here. This particular family here, very typical African couple, absolutely landless, 3 young kids living north of Nairobi. They're landless, so they live on her father's plot. His father owned 1½ acres, but he wouldn't let them farm because he was doing it. So the young man goes to the city to look for a job. Finally gets a job in Nairobi working in the slum in an informal sector restaurant, making $1 a day. With that, he has to pay his rent in the slum and send what's left over home to his family and 3 kids. Very, very typical story. This young man didn't like that idea at all. He saw this little thing, this little pump, $34 pump for sale. He started saving up his pennies. He went home. He got a family loan for the rest of it. He bought it. He rented 6 little plots of land that made up an acre. He started farming them, and within the first 3 months, he made $1,100 profit, and he rented out the pump for $1 a day to his neighbor, another $50, growing French beans, tomatoes, and corn. So these are nice stories, but on average, when somebody goes from not irrigating or irrigating with a bucket to irrigating with one of these pumps, they get 10 times their farm income. On average, it goes from $100 to $1,100. This is their net profit farm income. Literally taking people out of poverty into the middle class. It's not their total family income, so their family income is maybe going up by a factor of 2 or 3, but a huge change in their lives. And how many? Well, to date, over 105,000 profitable new businesses for farmers using these pumps. It's over 500,000 people who are literally out of poverty as a result. 1,500 new businesses being created every month. And what are the revenues? The revenues being generated, not the profits, but the revenues being generated from these businesses are already equivalent to 0.6% of the GDP in Kenya and 0.25% of GDP in Tanzania. And we know that GDP doesn't count a lot of things. Nonetheless, it gives some order of magnitude. And that's great, but how much money do we spend to get these kind of impacts? Is it cost effective? So for every donor dollar we spend, as a result of that, and I'll tell you how we spend it and why we spend it, these families make $12 in new profits and wages in their first 4 years. They go on making it forever, but just taking 4 years is a 12-to-1 return on the donor's investment. So how do we work? We identify great small business opportunities with our market study, subsector analysis, potential for thousands of businesses, environmentally sustainable, break even in 3 to 6 months. I've gone through the list. We have a design unit in Nairobi, and we design really a huge amount of engineering. Thousands of hours of engineering goes into these very, very simple things. These pumps are designed so you can take them apart with your hands. You don't need any screwdriver or hammer. A farmer doesn't have a screwdriver or hammer. You can put them back together. There's only one spare part, effectively, and that's easy. So very, very stringent design criteria, strong and durable, easy to maintain and use. Ergonomics is extremely important. People only have about 80 watts. Right? Barely enough to turn on a light bulb, and now you want them to irrigate 2 acres. You got to get the ergonomics right. And then there's also cultural issues. There's a lot of design that has to happen. We then have them mass-produced to high quality. We started producing them initially in Kenya. This pictures here is actually a factory in Kenya, teaching people how to do high-quality mass production. But we not very quickly, but we finally realized that, and it broke my heart, but we could not compete on price with China. So we've now moved all production to China. Because the bottom line is you want high-quality, cheap, really good goods at a low price. And then we need a supply chain. So we buy the best-selling pump, that treadle pump, say $68 when we land it from China. We add about a $10 margin. We sell to wholesalers, or we act as a wholesaler, either one. We sell to retail shops. These are little aggregate shops. Everybody is making money. Everybody is very motivated in this supply chain. We've got 450 of these retail shops all over the places where we work, in Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, Burkina Faso, every town, city, and village. And they're there. Now, getting a supply chain, it turns out, is not that hard. But selling a moneymaker pump is very hard. And why is that? Well, this is a brand new, big-ticket item that nobody has ever seen before or even dreamed about before, right? And we're selling it to the poorest, hardest to reach, most risk-averse people in the world, in a place with no marketing infrastructure, very little information infrastructure, no access to credit, and no savings. And on top of that, we have a problem with very limited word of mouth. So why is limited word of mouth? Because if you're a poor African farmer and you make a lot of money, you don't go screaming to your family, hey, I made a lot of money, or to your neighbors, hey, I made a lot of money. If you do, your third cousin once removed and everybody else will come and demand money, pay my school fees, and the money will be sucked out of you. So you don't go and shout when you make a lot of money. So word of mouth is very slow. So we have to do a huge marketing campaign to make this possible. Farming is not aspirational, by the way, in Africa. Nobody wants to be a farmer. We have to make it aspirational. Farming is my business. It's a business, right? We have to have good-looking farmers with huge piles of produce, proud-looking people in the advertising campaign. We're selling a better life. We're not selling a human-powered pump. We have to brand the retail shops. Stand out in a crowd. There's a lot of advertising. You got to have it stand out. We have live demonstrations there too. Billboards and promotions. Commissioned sales staff. We got about 160 of them, men and women, and we have to train them in sales. We have to give them knowledge of farming. Every day, each of them goes and identifies 5 hot prospects, people who might be interested in the pump, and then they learn to close those sales. And this is all over the country. We have fixed point demos at the retail shops and market days. We have street demos. And we have to get out to the farms. And this way it gets expensive because a lot of the farmers, especially the women, never leave the farm. If you're going to convince them to buy a pump, you got to get there and demonstrate on their farm. And so we go out to the farms. We work with lead farmers, women's and youth groups, agricultural shows, schools, companies, NGOs, anything and everything in order to spread the word about these pumps. We train our dealers. Many dealers in Africa are not very entrepreneurial in terms of they're used to coming from a command economy. They're not really sales-oriented. We have to train them. We have to give them commissions. We have to get them involved. We have dealer competitions. We use radio. We use call-in shows, phone promotions, all sorts of things. We do market storms where we line up vehicles and play music and spray water as we drive through the rural area. We do pumping competitions where we bring people together in the marketplace and they get up there and compete with each other, and at the end of the day somebody wins a pump and they sort of randomly pick people out of the crowd, and anything and everything to create a huge, huge buzz around these pumps. And introducing a completely new product into a new market anywhere in the world takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And let's just look at that. If we plot sales here on this plot in red, and we plot cost per sale in blue, we can see in the beginning, well, these are the early adopters we're selling to, the very early adopters. The very early adopters, the guy standing on the road, he's a fairly wealthy guy, you drive up in the bus, I'll take one of those, why not? Doesn't cost you very much to sell it to him. The cost of sales is not high, right? But very quickly, you get to an early adopter who doesn't live on the road. You have to get out to him. You have to build an infrastructure, a bigger organization. You have to hire people. You have to get out there with vehicles. You have to put advertising and marketing. Your sales really haven't taken off because you're still working with these early adopters, right? They just live in different places. Finally, your economies of scale start to kick in, and the cost of sale per sale starts to come down. And that continues, and then you reach some kind of critical mass, and at that point, your sales take off as word of mouth starts to happen, right? And all of a sudden, people start talking about this, and I've said word of mouth doesn't happen, but at some critical mass, you can no longer avoid it, because everybody starts to know about these things. And then the sales take off. Competition, of course, comes in when the price goes down, cost per sale goes down. In the beginning, nobody's competing with you, it's too expensive. And then you've created a whole new business. This is the true for any product in the world, anywhere in the world. Just remember, it took us 10 years to start using Amazon, just to change the way we shop. Amazon spent about $3.5 billion over those 10 years to convince us to shop on the internet, right? Us, the wealthiest people in the world, is a different way to buy a book. Anyway, it takes time and it takes money to convince people to do things. And that's a fundamental market failure. Private companies simply don't design brand new big-ticket products for poor farmers in Africa. They just don't do it. It's only profitable at scale, and even at scale, you got low margins, and it's hard to protect your IP, so competition kicks in. And it's way too much time and money to get to scale. It's just too hard to build that demand, so you have to lose money all along. So they don't even start. And that's why today, farmers in Africa are still using two tools, a machete and a hoe. Nobody's figured out how to sell them that third tool, and no private sector company is going to do it. So we have to use donor funds in order to get to that critical point, that tipping point, that critical mass. We use donor funds to overcome the market failure. Yes, it takes time and money, but we subsidize the market development. Now, where does that tipping point happen? We don't really know, but there's some evidence that it happens somewhere about 15 to 20% of market potential. And that's, if you look at other products around the world, it's been about there. But in the end, when you get to it, you leave in place this fully sustainable and profitable supply chain. All sorts of competition will come in, and we will have created an industry selling irrigation pumps in Africa. We're using donor funds, so that means we have to measure our cost effectiveness. So every pump comes with a 1-year guarantee. When a farmer comes into the retail shop, they fill out a guarantee form, their location, their address, their email address. No, they don't even have an address. If they're lucky, they have a cell phone number and their location, the nearest primary school or church. We get a database of all these farmers. We randomly select people from the database. We go visit them at 2 months after they bought the pump or 1 month after they bought the pump, and we spend 3 or 4 hours interviewing them. They've had no impact from the pump yet. They come back 18 months later. We come back 36 months later. We can now know what the real impacts are. We also gather market intelligence by talking to people. Any business that says impact monitoring is too expensive, you have to know your customer, and you have to gather market intelligence, and that's how you do it. And that's how we can be confident about our numbers. 105,000 successful businesses, $103 million per year in new profits and wages, and our cost to the donor, $350 to take a family out of poverty forever. Now that cost is all of our cost. That's everything from our fundraising to our R&D, our marketing, our impact monitoring, absolutely everything. About half of that is the marketing cost, though. We're also doing an external evaluation. We've just commissioned IFPRI to come and do a 3-year longitudinal study, just in case our internal numbers aren't believed, and also so we can learn a lot more. So what do we mean by a family out of poverty? What we mean is they no longer have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. They can buy basic clothes and shelter. They can afford to educate their kids in primary school, and they can afford basic health care. And that's only the first step. And with these pumps, we already got 160,000 kids in school for the first time, or in new schools. We got 15,000 families that built new houses, because really out of poverty means they can have all those initial things and have money left over to plan for the future. And if you think about poverty, that's really what it is. You're not worried about survival anymore. You can plan for your future. What do? You send your kids to secondary school, you make new investments, you buy a couple cows, you start new businesses, you get more education, you get a better life. What's our big picture here? My big picture is that we're building an entrepreneurial middle class in Africa. There's no place in the world that's developed without this. And how does that work? Well, I always talk about the cost of a vote. It'll be interesting to have John up here and hear about this. But the bottom line is, in rural Africa today, the cost of a vote is still very low. You can buy an election at $2 or $3 or even $1 per vote. But if people are making more money, they're not going to sell their vote for that price. Maybe it goes up to $10 or $15, $20 to convince them to vote for you. And that means you're going to get better governance, you're going to get better democracy, slightly better policies, more investment, growing economy, more jobs, the cost will go up again. Even in America, I always point out, the cost of a vote here is what? Only a few $100s probably to convince us to change our vote, many people. So I think, in my opinion, this is the ultimate solution, building this entrepreneurial middle class to reverse this downward spiral. The global potential for these pumps is something like 35, 40 million, about 15, 20 million of those in Africa. We've sold 105,000, got 105,000 farmers using these pumps, so just scratching the surface. Should we scale this up? It's always a good question to ask, to scale or not to scale. I don't have time to go into it here, but I do have a website called realgoodnotfeelgood.org, where I talk about how you decide whether to scale something or not. Realgoodnotfeelgood.org. And in this case, if you go through that, you would see this is something worth scaling. So a good model and a good product turns out is not enough. Because, like I said, this is the most challenging marketing and sales job in the world. Coca-Cola, they're selling a sweet, addictive drink. It took them 10 or 15 years to really take off in Africa, and almost that long to get profitable. We're selling a very, very different, much more difficult product. So we have to be better at marketing and sales than Coca-Cola. We've got a long, long way to go. But first of all, we need a high-performing organization. We need a great management team. We need excellent staff. We've got about 250 people in 6 countries. We need great systems. This is recruitment and training is absolutely critical. Performance management systems. ERP, so we know what's going on throughout the organization. We have our data, we have our key indicators, and we have to put in place a learning and improvement environment. And we need great fundraising to make all that happen. We're raising about $7 million a year. We're working to scale that up. So again, all this is necessary but expensive. We also have to partner to accelerate growth. We can't do it on our own. We can't reach scale on our own. And so we export our pumps. We sell to the UN, to NGOs all across Africa. And we're leveraging their donor funds. They go out and raise the money. They do the distribution, and all we do is sell to them, and by the container load. All the big NGOs are using our pumps all across Africa. We sell to governments also across Africa. We have our own distributors. We're active ourselves in Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, and Burkina Faso. We have our own distributors in these other 6 countries. In fact, as of today, I think it's 8 countries. They then sell to local NGOs and CBOs and groups, which we couldn't meet. We partner with MFIs, so people can get loans for the pumps, and banks. We partner with big companies, private sector, to help us really scale it up. And eventually we'll be earning and selling carbon credits. We redesign the pumps for lower cost production. We do massive design changes. We do a lot of design and engineering on these pumps. If you're going to produce them in China, you've got to pack them in tighter spaces. Our latest redesign, we reduced the pump landed cost of our best-selling pump by $17, 5 kilos lighter. Stainless steel plates, so it's less rust resistant, more rust resistant, 5% more efficient. We've got new products, working on a deep lift pump that can go down to 45 feet and 40 feet pressure. And we got a couple patented technologies there, and other new irrigation technologies. And then you have to use technology to really accelerate sales and impacts. And when I say technology here, I'm talking about cell phone technology. I told you about the hot prospecting. We get this database. We've now got a database of every day. We collect about 500 names of hot prospects. And we then use cell phones to close those sales. We have a system we've built that looks like Salesforce, where people go in, and it's a web-based system to figure out how to sell better to these people once they know the constraints of the buyers. Cell phone marketing, gathering information from the customers, again with cell phones. Cell phone layaway. It's really hard to buy a pump if you can't save your money. Why don't you save your money? You can now transfer money with cell phones. We're setting up a system now where you can do micro savings with a cell phone into a savings account, tell you have enough money to buy the pump. You can send out farming information. And now we're putting together, just starting to brainstorm and put together something we're calling sort of Facebook for farmers, working on cell phones. How do you get social networking about pumps? How do you get farmers to make referrals and get this word of mouth going? What does it take to convince them to do that? And how can you do that with cell phones, SMS, and voice? So in the next 5 years, we're building our capacity. We want to get to the point where we sell over 100,000 pumps per year. That would be 80,000 new businesses per year, 400,000 people out of poverty per year, and about $50 to take a person out of poverty. That's where we're trying to get to as in the next 4 years. Just to talk about some of these final farmers very, very quickly. This couple was caught up in the Eldoret violence, and the thugs stopped just literally about 50 meters from their house. Elderly couple. This guy says there's unlimited demand for his vegetables that he's growing with a little hip pump. This family lost absolutely everything. Their father had taken out a loan on the land. They lost the land. They lost the cows. They moved. They were squatters. They were living in a little tiny mud hut. They saw one of these pumps. They saved up with a bucket, bought one of these pumps. Today, they own a maize mill. They have a huge house. And they've got a petrol pump now. They've given the other pump to their brother. This was a school teacher who retired in Western Kenya, and he spent two things. He bought a 16th-acre plot, and he bought a pump. And he's keeping 13 people alive with that little pump on that 16-acre plot with this little hip pump. These are people who were displaced in the violence in Kenya. They were living in the camps. These are the first family out of the camp back to their plot. You can see they built a little shack there. They first came back to their plot. Because they bought a pump, they're now selling food to the people in the camp, and they told us very proudly they're actually selling food to the people who burnt down their houses, because every house in that area was burnt flat, and they moved back, and they're actually bringing peace to that place. Just very quickly, we went back to visit Felix and Lucy recently. The day we visited them, they had $6,500 worth of tomatoes in their field, and other products. And they employ 3 to 10 people when they're harvesting. And so we can create millions of new businesses if we understand that the poor's biggest need is to make more money, if we design new money-making products and business models, if we establish a private sector supply chain, if we spend time and money to develop the market, and if we leverage partnerships and technology to bring it to scale. Thanks a lot.
Wow, wasn't that amazing? I don't know if I've ever seen such a strong analysis business case explained like that. And I have to say it makes me extremely excited to see this kind of level of thought coming into the sector. So thank you, Martin. So we have a series of questions for our 2 speakers. I'm assuming most of you were here on the first day when John Githongo spoke. If you weren't, you really missed out. Amazing, honest speech about what were basically the main themes that we've had in this conference and how important it is to be doing these types of events where we're talking about these issues. John is from Kenya, like I said before, and was a major player in exposing corruption in Africa. And so we have a bunch of questions here. There's a lot of very detailed questions for Martin, which were really, really good. And I would love to find a way to actually get answers to those questions. We only have about 25 minutes. And so for this, I wanted to kind of stay a little bit higher thematic level and pick out the questions that I think that both of them would have particular insights on. So I think probably the best place to start is and I'm going to come sit with you guys, I think, because that would be better, is what makes you guys hopeful about Africa? What trends are emerging that you're particularly excited about and that you plan to kind of position yourself to take advantage of in the next 10 to 20 years?
Okay, I mean, overall, if you ask me what am I optimistic in about Africa, I would say it's the people. And certainly from all our experience, it's the people of Africa who are going to turn it around. Like I said, however poor they might be, extremely entrepreneurial, hardworking, and very, very driven. I really think that the backbone of Africa development is going to remain agriculture for quite some time, because that's where there's huge, huge potential to increase what they're doing. The world is going to be needing a whole lot more food. The predictions are by 2050, we're going to need twice the amount of food in the world, even though the population is only going to be 50% bigger, but people will be eating more food and higher up on the food chain. And I think Africa is the place where we can grow that food. And that means that we're going to have to introduce a move from very low-tech subsistence farming to much, much higher tech. It means these small farms are going to have to consolidate. But I really think that going forward, Africa has huge potential to become the food basket for the world. And that's one thing I'm very optimistic about. There's a few other things, but I want John to speak a bit first.
Thank you, Martin. I think that is just the kind of answer that I would have given. I think the key thing that Africa has going for it is people. As I said yesterday, it's a youthful population. We have a major youth bulge in Africa. And it's out of that economies are able to move to the next stage. Information technology and developments in technology are allowing Africa really to move from the third world into the first world, in a very short space of time. I talked yesterday about Tunisia and the kind of challenges that they were having there in the morning. And in the afternoon, I found that the youth had demonstrated, and the president of Tunisia had to flee the country. He's now living in Saudi Arabia. That only took place in the last 24 hours. It was fueled by the youth using social networking, resisting the kind of difficulties and challenges and corruption that had been afflicting them for over 20 years. It's in the people, it's in the youth, and they're the future.
Absolutely, and I just want to add that, I think this idea of high technology coming in, ITC, we're actually leapfrogging in Africa, as John said, and because the nice thing about technology is you need smart people, and Africa's got a lot of smart people. You don't need a huge amount of capital costs. And already some of the programming and innovation that's coming out of Kenya and many other places is just, absolutely top level. And so there's a huge potential there for creating the jobs for the youth. But absolutely we have to solve this issue of the youth. As I pointed out, half the population is under 19. And that is one of the major challenges. In the same way, it's one of the major opportunities going forward.
Great, thanks guys. There's a series of questions that I think are actually quite insightful that try and draw the connections between the two of you, kind of relating how government and business kind of intertwine. So looking at, how, Mr. Githongo, how you've seen the government interact with business in Kenya, and then also whether you've come across any sorts of corruption or you have any partnership with government that helps you kind of facilitate your business.
I think that government has, something that I mentioned yesterday, I think government is now populated with a critical mass of people across civil society, the academia, government, who speak the same language, who understand that we're living in a globalized economy and there's a need for us to be able to compete and to deal with this bulge. If we don't deal with the bulge, then we'll have the kind of difficulties some leaders are having in different parts of the continent and are being chased out of their palaces. So there's a fire under the seat of government, which is not always a very bad thing, and it's forcing changes to the way government works in Africa. It's slow, and there's still a lot of not very nice things happening, and they tend to get a lot of the coverage. But I always remind people that 10, 15 years ago, when we had the Organization of African Unity, it had two basic principles that were not changeable. You couldn't interfere in the internal affairs of your neighbor, and the colonial borders that we had inherited were inviolable. And those were two principles of the Organization of African Unity. And I'm thankful to say, just in the last 10 years, we've seen this idea that you can't interfere in the affairs of your neighbor is gone, that now we can interfere, that if somebody decides to commit genocide across the border, you have to go in there and do something about it. I think that's extremely important. It comes together with economic integration that's moving at a very rapid pace. And finally, and I'm very hopeful about this, with economic integration, we're seeing the falling away of the colonial borders, which were inviolable. And I pray in our side of the continent, for example, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Southern Sudan, will be one entity quite quickly, not because of simple just politicians wanting it to happen, but economic imperatives, political, social imperatives, making it a must. People are already integrating, governments are running to catch up. That's a good thing for Africa, and that's going to drive the future peace and prosperity of our region.
I mean, absolutely for development, we need, as John says, we need supportive environments for business. And I think we're all aware that it hasn't always been the case in Africa. I agree with John, though, there's a growing awareness amongst the people in the government, especially some of the younger people in government, that this is critical. And they are starting to have better laws along these lines, and things like freer trade across borders. But we've still got a little way for implementation to catch up with policy, because you can change laws, and this is something we've seen in Africa a lot, where you actually look at the laws on the book, and you just see that actually, well, it looks like a pretty good environment for business, but then the actual implementation, all sorts of other things happen. Some all the way down to from the bottom to the top in terms of sort of petty bureaucrats, all the way to the top where large-scale corruption is taking place. So, like John, I'm optimistic. These things take time. You don't just turn these things on and off overnight. We need patience, but we're moving in the right direction.
So one of the big themes at this conference has been bringing out a little more honesty and conversation and admitting failure. So I'd like to take it to maybe a little bit more of a personal question. You both have had, like I said, paths that have required great courage, but it must have been a bumpy road somewhere along the line. I was curious if you would be willing to share some of your kind of hardships, failures over the last time of your career, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I think I talked in my talk there quite a bit about the failures of the early years, where we really were, quite idealistic, and we really thought what we were doing made sense. I think one of the key things about failures is they're not really a failure until you recognize them. And there's a real issue in development that people don't like to recognize failures. And I think that's one of the things that I always try to do, is look very, very critically at what I was personally doing. So, for example, our whole water program, although I was the one who set that up, looking back, it was like, yeah, this is not really working. On a sort of design failure that we've done, one of the things we did was with this hip pump sitting in front of me here, we actually launched a very, very low cost. It only cost about $19, $20 a pump, which really did look like a bicycle pump. It didn't have the pivot that this pump has. And it actually sold very well. It sold like hotcakes because it was so cheap. But selling is not our objective. Impacts on poverty are objective. And so after 6 months of sales, we went out and we said, okay, let's actually measure the impact. And what we discovered is that people were abandoning the thing because it was so hard to use. People weren't actually using it for agriculture at all. Wealthy people were buying it because it was so cheap and just sort of tossing it in the back of the vehicle. And so much to the disappointment of all of our sales staff, we actually discontinued the product. They were getting some nice commission selling it.
So yeah, I mean, you always have to be looking and learning from your failures. And if you don't make failures, you don't make any progress. So I'm, I'm all in favor of making, having failures.
Thank you. I'm glad you answered that question first. I think in the anti-corruption field, one can go into a whole range of lessons that one can. We can have another conference about that. But I think when you talk about development in areas where governance institutions, the judiciary, the legislature, the executive, the security services are still in a stage of development, one has to recognize, and I'm not being cynical here, that for every need, often there's a competing greed. And when you identify the need, it's easy to get excited, and you can, you immediately grapple with it and begin to work with people using your enthusiasm and excitement to deal with it. I think it's good to keep in the back of your mind that there is a competing greed, even around poverty. Poverty makes some people in some places extremely rich. Poverty is good for a small minority of people around this world. And it's sometimes hard for us sitting in a group that has got this kind of positive energy that is here with Engineers Without Borders to imagine that there are people like that. But that's a truth. That's what life is about, that there are people who make a living selling arms to places where they know they're going to be used by children and do very, very difficult and wrong things. Just to recognize, for every need, there's a competing greed hiding somewhere. Recognize it, find it, mitigate against it as early as possible, so you're not disappointed and it doesn't dispirit you.
So there is one technical question in here that I feel very compelled to ask, because as most of you know, I've been a big part of the water program over the last few years, and one of the things we're particularly concerned about is broken pumps. So it looks like lots of people have been listening to our our themed discussions around broken pumps in Africa, and so we have several questions asking about spare parts and yeah, who's out there providing services to repair the KickStart pumps.
Great. So one thing to keep in mind is that with individual ownership, at least you have the incentives right to fix a broken pump. Because you own it, you bought it, you're making your living on it, and if you don't fix it, actually all your vegetables are going to dry up and you have a problem and you lose your crop. So the incentives are very well aligned. We design our pumps, like I said, with a huge amount of engineering going into them. Every minor design change we make, we literally do thousands of hours of live testing where we actually pay people to sit there and pump. So we design these things so they actually don't break down very easily. We design, for example, our treadle pump so you can have a 120 kilo person jumping on the end of the treadles and they won't break it. And the reason we do this is because we know that if a pump is taken out in the rural area and breaks down, somebody's going to lose their crop and lose their livelihood. All our pumps come with a 1-year guarantee. If anything does go wrong, you get a free pump. And now that's in the places where we have our retail networks, which is in Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, and Burkina Faso. So in those places, we have 450 retail shops. You go down to your local shop, you buy your pump. You can also go there and buy your spare parts. As I said before, these pumps, you can take them apart with your hands. You don't need a screwdriver or a hammer. You can put them back together. You can replace those spare parts. And you can buy those very few spare parts in the retail shop. When we're doing the export pumps, it's a bigger challenge. And there we export every pump with a set of spare parts. And so even if you don't have access in the local country to spare parts, at least you can go through 2 sets of piston cups, and that'll give you at least 2 years, and sometimes as much as 4 or 5 years of operation with the pump. And then we also, once we get a critical mass of pumps in a country, as we have in Malawi and other places, in Zambia, we do set up distributors, and we make sure they do have the spare parts in stock as well.
Okay, I have a specific question for you, John, here. The book, It's Our Turn to Eat. We have a specific question around what what has happened since that book was released? Like, what was the effect of having a book like that out there where you're exposing kind of new ideas and insights to a system that people don't normally see?
Well, thanks. Well, the book was actually, everybody calls it John Githongo's book. It was written by Michaela Rong, is a friend and was a journalist with the Financial Times for a long time, and I got to know Michaela when she was Financial Times correspondent in Kenya, and I love the book she wrote about Zaire and President Mobutu, and so we got to know each other from then. And I mean, the effect that the book had was, I would say, in a sense, it was serialized in one of the major papers. Not that many copies were sold within Kenya itself, simply because people couldn't afford it. And so, in that sense, amongst the middle class, it's fairly well known. I think the most interesting effect that I've seen it have is that the main Protestant union of churches in Kenya took it upon themselves to create a Bible study out of the book. I didn't know about that. As I said, I never made any money from the book. The book was written and published, and that was it, and I went on with my own life. And I was traveling up country in Kenya, and I heard that they were discussing this book in a church, and they're having a Bible study based on the book. So that's interesting. So I'll be honest, I don't actually, I get the sense of different ways that the book is affecting behavior and perceptions in Kenya all the time. And I'm learning as well, depending on where I am, because it's being used in so many different ways, online and on the ground by different players.
All right, we're running out of time, unfortunately. I would actually love to ask all of these questions, but never can. One last question for you guys before we close. A lot of people are curious about what you'll be taking away from this conference. John, you've been here for 2 full days. I hope gone to several sessions, spoken to several people. You've been here for a day. What will you take away?
I think for me, as I said, there's a huge number of you in the audience who are very actively doing stuff out in the field. And compared to when I graduated from Stanford and I made the decision to head off to Kenya, at that time there was nobody in university even thinking about this stuff, engineering for global good. And so it's absolutely great for me to see the number of people and also the way that you're actually studying. Because I can see that it's a very, very serious attempt to really understand what can work and what can't work. And so much of development is done without that kind of analysis and look. So from my point of view, I'm just very, very impressed and very happy to see this number of engineers who want to get involved in this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, as I said, when I came here, I had a different idea of what Engineers Without Borders meant. And this has been a revelation and an inspiration for me to be able to come here and just share the spirit. I think that's, for me, been the most special thing about who you are. Just feeling the spirit of people who want to go out there and do good and have a sense of a common humanity. They're willing to live. People who are willing to drop themselves into villages in places that I've never been. That's a great thing. You lose that, then wear a suit and become a consultant. But and I've loved the conference. I've loved the conference. I mean, I've had great difficulty choosing which sessions to attend, to be frank, because you turn the page and it's a choice of 4 or 5 sessions that you'd like to get into. And then today I attended a session on China and Africa, and just the sheer depth. I think this conference could have gone on for a full week. and still we wouldn't have exhausted ourselves. So this is a very special event that you've brought together. I look forward to the 20th anniversary of the Engineers Without Borders, when there are 4,000 of you, and many of you have come back from Africa and other places, and we are all sharing, and we'll see chapters of Engineers Without Borders in places like Kenya and other places, because that's what the world will be, a connected place, and you're making it happen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, you guys. Such a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
I speak for all of us, I think. It's such a tremendous honor to have such distinguished guests here to share their thoughts. We have some gifts for you. There's some cloth made specially for the conference from Ghana, which is... There you go. And this is kind of...
Got my chocolate. Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks a lot.
I got one yesterday.
Great.
Wonderful.
I just want to stick around and talk, if any of you can stick around, if anybody wants to answer some of those more technical questions for about half an hour, or otherwise I'll also be at the affair tonight. So I'm happy to talk there also. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Wonderful. So just to close out the conference here, just a few last thoughts before everybody rushes out. We'll have some amazing speeches at the gala, so I won't go on for too long here. But I think it's really important, while we're still kind of in our regular clothes, all sitting together at the end of all these sessions, to just think a little bit about what the conference means to us. When I asked what the trends were that the speakers were excited about, they talked about believing in the people of Africa. And I know after being overseas for 4 years, I don't know many things. Development's really, really complicated. But the one thing that I'm absolutely sure of is that I believe in the African people and in Africa too. And I think that anyone who's been overseas can echo that. So I wanted to leave you with kind of an analogy or a thought to think about. And it's the idea of liberating structures. Structures that allow you and others to fulfill your potential. So when you think of the effect that EWB has had on all of our lives, I think probably everybody in this room can say that we've grown through association with this organization, through having role models, support networks that help you go through hard times, and people who push you with new ideas. I personally have gone through a massive personal transformation through this organization. I've been involved for 4 years. Before this, I worked in the oil and gas industry as an engineer, a technical engineer. I didn't spend more than a couple seconds of my life thinking about Africa. Now I spend just about every waking moment thinking about Africa. It's important to me and it's important to all of us. So what I wanted to leave with you is this idea of the liberating structure, and think about how the things that may have made EWB really important to us are the same kinds of things that we need in Africa. It can come in many, many forms. But at the end of the day, that's why we're here and that's what it's about. Liberating this potential that's untapped. So there's two big things that this conference does to help us achieve that goal. One of our goals was to start a new role for EWB, We wanted to be the convener of new conversations. We were frustrated that there wasn't enough honest, real conversations out there about what needs to happen. We wanted to create subversive conversations, one that turned things on their heads. We brought people in from all different places, people from the field, experts in the sector, powerful people in the sector, influential thought leaders from outside the sector. We put them at tables to talk. These people don't usually get together. Getting new and interesting conversations to come out it's hard to do, and we're learning. It will be great to reflect back on this conference and see how well we've done this and learn for next time, because we think it's a really important role for us to be playing in the future. So the idea behind this is just, what role does EWB have in helping the world, the sector, private sector, governments, all these different bodies create these liberating structures for these people in Africa that are so amazing and need opportunity. Second one is what your role is in creating these liberating structures. How can you recreate the experience that you've had to become the leaders that you are for others that haven't had that opportunity? What does this conference mean in that pursuit? So it's really important, I think, for all of us that we look at the stories we tell ourselves, what we're scared of, what's stopping us from doing the different things in our lives that we think we need to do to make change. And I think we all need to think about what we're going to do tomorrow, next week, next year, the concrete actions that we can take to push us a little bit further towards that. So if we can move away from this conference thinking about that, I think all of us who created this conference would be very, very happy and feel like we're successful. So I think you can all give yourselves a huge round of applause, because none of this would have been possible without the energy and the community that exists within EWB. And have a great time at the gala.